I've learned that the loudest person holding a rule book usually isn't the one holding the deed. The first thing I noticed wasn't the patrol car parked beside the clubhouse. It was the smell of fresh asphalt warming beneath the Texas sun and the faint scent of coffee drifting from a paper cup someone had left on the stone entry wall. The neighborhood looked exactly like every glossy real estate brochure promised. Perfect lawns trimmed with ruler precision. White fences without a single chip. Matching mailboxes standing like soldiers at attention. It was quiet enough to hear the slow click of a sprinkler head rotating across emerald grass. I eased my truck into the visitor parking lot, shut off the engine, picked up my worn black leather portfolio, and walked toward the clubhouse without the slightest hurry. My shoes crunched across decorative gravel as if the entire place had been waiting for that sound. Before I reached the front steps, a sharp voice sliced through the morning air. "Stop right there." I looked up to see a woman in a bright white blazer marching toward me with the confidence of someone who believed every sidewalk belonged to her. Patricia Whitmore, though everyone called her Patty, carried a clipboard like it was a badge. Behind her came 3 board members wearing matching polo shirts embroidered with the HOA logo. They spread out across the entrance as though they had rehearsed this exact moment. Patty smiled, but it never reached her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. I returned the smile. "I'm here to look around." Her expression hardened immediately. "Residents only." I glanced at the clubhouse, then back at her. "That's interesting." She folded her arms. "Which address do you live at?" I answered honestly. "None." One board member chuckled under his breath. Another lifted his phone and started recording. Patty tilted her head with the kind of polite disbelief that always comes before someone decides they're in charge of your morning. "Then you're trespassing." I shrugged. "Actually, I'm not a member." The sentence landed like someone had dropped a wrench onto polished concrete. For a second, nobody spoke. Then came the whispers. "Did he just admit it? Call security. Get this on video." Patty stepped closer, the perfume she wore barely covering the scent of fresh mulch lining the flower beds. "If you're not a member, you have no business on HOA property." I adjusted my grip on the portfolio without opening it. "Is that so?" She nodded with absolute certainty. "You need to leave immediately." "I'd rather stay." Her smile disappeared completely. She pulled out her phone, tapped 3 quick buttons, and looked directly into my eyes while speaking loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Hello, dispatch. We have an unauthorized individual refusing to leave private HOA property." I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I simply watched a breeze ripple the American flag above the clubhouse roof while the metal halyard clicked softly against the pole. One officer would later tell me that calm people make nervous people talk too much. Patty proved that theory in less than 5 minutes. By the time the first patrol car rolled into the parking lot with its lights flashing but no siren, she had explained to half the neighborhood how she was protecting community standards from outsiders who thought the rules didn't apply to them. Homeowners began gathering on their driveways, coffee mugs in hand, curious faces turning toward the clubhouse. Every phone seemed pointed in my direction. Nobody noticed the black portfolio still resting quietly at my side. Nobody asked why I never once tried to walk away. And nobody, especially Patty, had the faintest idea that the building behind her had changed owners 48 hours earlier. The first officer climbed out of the patrol car with the relaxed posture of someone expecting another routine neighborhood disagreement instead of anything serious. His sunglasses reflected the clubhouse windows as he walked toward us, notebook already in one hand. The second officer stayed a few steps behind, quietly observing the growing crowd. The air carried the smell of freshly cut grass mixed with warm concrete, and somewhere across the street a lawn mower hummed without interruption, as if the neighborhood itself refused to acknowledge the small storm gathering outside its own front door. Patty wasted no time. She pointed directly at me before either officer could ask a single question. "He admitted he is not a member. He refuses to leave private HOA property. We want him removed immediately." The officer nodded politely before turning toward me. "Sir, may I ask your name?" "Ethan Caldwell." He wrote it down carefully. "Do you live in this community?" "No." Patty folded her arms with visible satisfaction, convinced the conversation was already over. Several homeowners whispered to one another. I could hear fragments floating through the warm morning air. That should settle it. He picked the wrong neighborhood. Patty never loses these arguments. I almost smiled, not because they were wrong, but because they had not yet realized they were asking the wrong questions. The officer looked back at me. "May I ask why you are here today?" I lifted the black leather portfolio slightly. "Business." Patty laughed softly, the kind of laugh people use when they believe they are watching someone make a foolish mistake. "Business? We do not conduct business with strangers." I answered in the same calm tone I had used from the beginning. "You might today." Her confidence only grew stronger. "This clubhouse belongs to the association. The parking lot belongs to the association. The office belongs to the association. You cannot simply walk in because you feel like it." I listened without interrupting. Years earlier, I had learned that people reveal far more when nobody competes with them for the conversation. My father used to tell me that silence was often the most profitable investment a businessman could make. He spent 30 years buying neglected shopping centers, small office buildings, and forgotten commercial lots across Texas. I grew up sitting beside him inside county record offices that smelled like old paper and furniture polish, watching him trace property lines with a pencil instead of making emotional decisions. He never chased headlines. He chased signatures. After he retired, I continued building the company the same way. Quiet acquisitions, thorough research, no publicity. If a property appeared ordinary, I looked twice. If everyone believed they already understood who owned something, I looked 3 times. That habit had served me well for more than a decade, which was exactly why I found myself standing outside this clubhouse instead of somewhere else that morning. Nothing about this place had been random. Every document inside my portfolio had been reviewed more than once. Every survey map had matched the county records. Every signature had been notarized. Every transfer had already been recorded. The transaction had closed 48 hours earlier without attracting a single headline, exactly as I preferred. Patty stepped closer again, lowering her voice as though she were offering friendly advice. "Mr. Caldwell, save yourself the embarrassment. Leave now before this becomes a bigger problem." I met her eyes and answered honestly. "I do not think I am the one who should be worried about that." She interpreted my calm as arrogance. The officers interpreted it as confidence. Those 2 impressions would lead to very different endings before the morning was over. The older officer shifted his notebook under one arm and looked from Patty to me with the patient expression of someone who had learned that neighborhood disputes usually contain 2 completely different versions of the same story. "Sir," he said, "do you have any identification with you?" I handed him my driver's license without a word. He studied it for a moment, then gave it back. Patty immediately stepped into the silence again. "Officer, this should be simple." He admitted he does not live here. He admitted he is not part of the association. "We have every right to remove unauthorized visitors." Her confidence spread through the small crowd like sunlight across a driveway. A few homeowners nodded. One man folded his newspaper under his arm as if he expected the conversation to end within seconds. Another neighbor quietly remarked that Patty always knew the rules better than anyone else. I noticed something else. Nobody questioned where those rules actually ended. They simply assumed the painted curbs, the clubhouse walls, the parking lot, and even the sidewalks automatically belonged to the association because they had always been told they did. That assumption was the reason I had become interested in this property months earlier. While everyone focused on neighborhood politics, I focused on county records. While everyone argued about bylaws, I followed ownership chains. Real estate has a funny way of rewarding people who read the documents everyone else ignores. The younger officer glanced toward the clubhouse entrance. "Is there someone from the management company available?" Patty answered before anyone else could speak. "They work for us. I can handle everything." The officer nodded politely, but did not write that statement down. Instead, he looked at the bronze plaque mounted beside the front door. The morning sun reflected across the polished metal, making the engraved letters almost impossible to read from where we stood. I had read those words several times during my research. They were decorative, impressive, and almost completely irrelevant to the legal ownership of the land beneath them. Patty continued speaking, growing more comfortable every minute. She explained how the board enforced community standards, approved budgets, supervised maintenance, and protected property values. She sounded less like a volunteer president and more like the chief executive of a private corporation. Every sentence carried the certainty of someone who had never expected another authority to question her understanding of the neighborhood. I simply listened. The portfolio remained closed in my left hand. More than once, one of the officers glanced toward it, probably wondering why I had not produced whatever documents I claimed to have. There was a reason for that. Timing matters almost as much as evidence. My attorney used to remind me that facts have greater impact after assumptions have fully exposed themselves. Interrupt too early, and people only defend their original position. Wait long enough, and they build the entire case against themselves. Patty was doing exactly that. She pointed toward the clubhouse windows. Everything you see here belongs to this association. Every office, every meeting room, every parking space. We control access because we own it. I noticed the older officer pause for the first time since arriving. He looked at her carefully before asking one short question. You personally verified the ownership records before making that statement? The neighborhood suddenly became much quieter. Even the steady buzz of the lawn mower several houses away seemed to fade beneath the weight of that single question. Patty answered without hesitation. Of course I did. I lowered my eyes for just a moment toward the black leather portfolio, feeling the smooth edge of the recorded warranty deed beneath my fingertips. The paper had already been filed at the county office 2 days earlier. It was no longer waiting to become legal. It already was. Patty lifted her chin as though the question itself had offended her. I have been president of this association for 6 years, she replied. I know exactly what belongs to this community. The older officer gave a slow nod, but did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked around the property with fresh eyes, taking in the clubhouse, the parking lot, the landscaped entrance, and the row of decorative oak trees that lined the sidewalk. The breeze carried the earthy smell of damp mulch after the sprinklers had finished their morning cycle, and somewhere behind, the building and air conditioning unit started with a low mechanical hum. It was remarkable how ordinary everything appeared. The most expensive misunderstandings usually do. Patty mistook the officer's silence for agreement and pressed her advantage. We have had problems with outsiders before. People think they can use our facilities, hold meetings here, or park without permission. We have to protect what belongs to our residents. One of the board members eagerly added. We even replaced every lock last year to make sure only authorized people could enter. Another proudly explained that they had upgraded the security cameras, installed new key card readers, and spent thousands of dollars improving the building over the past 2 years. I quietly listened to every detail. Every improvement they described matched the invoices I had reviewed during due diligence. Every renovation had increased the value of the structure sitting on the parcel that had quietly changed ownership. The younger officer looked toward me again. Mr. Caldwell, is there something you would like to add? I answered with only a few words. Not yet. Patty laughed again, this time louder, hoping the crowd would join her. Several neighbors did. She pointed toward my portfolio. If there were anything important in there, you would have shown it already. I simply adjusted the handle in my hand. The leather had softened over years of carrying contracts through county offices across Texas. My father always insisted that documents deserved better treatment than emotions because documents lasted longer. I remembered following him through courthouse hallways as a teenager, hearing the echo of our footsteps across polished tile floors while he explained that ownership was never determined by confidence. It was determined by recorded paper. That lesson had shaped every investment I had ever made. 3 months earlier, one overlooked filing had caught my attention. A commercial holding company had quietly listed this parcel for sale after the previous ground lease expired. The homeowners association continued operating as if nothing had changed. The management company kept collecting dues. The board kept scheduling meetings. Residents kept believing the clubhouse automatically belonged to the association because it always had. Nobody bothered to notice that land ownership and building management were not always the same thing. Those overlooked details were where opportunities lived. The older officer interrupted my thoughts. Mr. Caldwell, are you refusing to identify your reason for being here? No, officer. I am waiting until everyone finishes explaining their position. He looked at me for a moment, then closed his notebook without writing another word. Patty mistook that gesture as another victory. Excellent, she said with a satisfied smile. Then I would like him formally removed from the property. The officer turned toward me one more time. If you have documents that affect this situation, now would be an appropriate time to present them. Around us, every conversation stopped. The phones recording the encounter remained perfectly still. Even Patty's smile held frozen in place as I finally set the black leather portfolio on the hood of my truck, released the brass clasp with a quiet metallic click, and slowly opened it to the first page. The brass clasp settled against the side of the portfolio with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than every conversation around us. I did not rush. I never had. Real estate transactions worth millions of dollars were rarely decided by whoever moved first. They were decided by whoever had the better paperwork. I carefully removed a thin stack of documents held together with a simple black binder clip and placed them on the hood of my truck. The older officer stepped closer while the younger officer shifted beside him, both waiting without interruption. Patty leaned forward just enough to catch a glimpse of the first page before letting out a confident smile. "Property brochures?" she asked. "That is not going to help you." I looked at her and calmly shook my head. "No. Recorded documents." The words barely changed her expression. She still believed this was another bluff. She crossed her arms again and addressed the officers instead of me. "Anyone can print paperwork from the internet these days." The older officer answered before I could. "That is why we verify it." He picked up the first document carefully and scanned the heading. I noticed his eyes pause for a fraction of a second before moving farther down the page. Without saying anything, he turned to the second page, then the third. His expression remained professional, but his pace slowed noticeably. The younger officer glanced over his shoulder, reading portions of the same document while occasionally looking back toward the clubhouse. Around us, the crowd sensed something had changed even though nobody knew exactly what it was. The cheerful whispers disappeared. The phones that had been recording for entertainment suddenly became perfectly still. Even Patty stopped smiling for a moment, trying to read the officers instead of the paperwork. "Is something wrong?" she finally asked. The older officer did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the final page where the county recording stamp sat clearly above the signature block. He traced one finger across the document number before asking me a simple question. "Mr. Caldwell, do you have identification matching the purchaser listed here?" "Yes, officer." I handed him my driver's license once again. He compared the name on the license with the name printed on the recorded warranty deed, then quietly handed both items to his partner. Neither officer spoke for several long seconds. The only sound came from the flagpole cable tapping lightly against the aluminum pole as another warm breeze crossed the parking lot. Patty finally stepped closer, her confidence beginning to crack around the edges. "What exactly are you looking at?" The younger officer answered with careful professionalism. "We are verifying ownership information." She laughed nervously. "Ownership? We already know who owns this place." Neither officer responded. Instead, the older officer pulled out his department phone and entered the county recording number from the top of the document. I recognized the familiar sequence immediately because I had checked it myself twice before leaving my office that morning. A loading circle spun across his screen while everyone waited. It lasted only a few seconds, but the silence made it feel much longer. Then his eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. He turned the screen toward his partner without showing anyone else. The younger officer looked at it, read the information twice, and slowly exhaled. For the first time since arriving, both officers looked toward the clubhouse not as a neighborhood amenity, but as a piece of legally recorded real estate, and I knew the conversation was about to move away from assumptions and into facts. The older officer lowered his phone and looked directly at Patty with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving, but his voice carried a different weight now. "Ma'am, I need to ask you a few questions before we go any further." Patty blinked, clearly expecting him to address me instead. "Questions for me? What?" He held the recorded deed in one hand while lightly tapping the county confirmation on his screen with the other. "Because the ownership records we just verified do not match the statements that have been made this morning." A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Neighbors exchanged puzzled looks. One homeowner quietly lowered his coffee mug. Another stopped recording and stared toward the clubhouse as though seeing it for the first time. Patty forced out a short laugh that sounded much less confident than before. "There must be some mistake." The officer shook his head. "The county records indicate this parcel was transferred through a recorded transaction 48 hours ago." She immediately answered, "That is impossible." I remained silent. The younger officer unfolded the attached survey map across the hood of my truck. The paper shifted gently in the breeze before he placed one hand on each corner. Colored boundary lines surrounded the clubhouse, the management office, the parking lot, the landscaped entrance, and the walking path leading to the front doors. He traced the property outline with one finger before looking back toward the actual buildings standing only a few yards away. Every line on the survey matched exactly what stood in front of us. "This survey is consistent with the recorded legal description," he said quietly to his partner. Patty stepped closer, trying to look over the map. "That cannot be right. The association has used this building for years," I answered for the first time in several minutes. Using a property and owning a property are not always the same thing. She looked directly at me, searching for some sign that I was joking. There was none. The older officer turned another page inside the document packet. "Mr. Caldwell, according to these records, your company purchased the commercial parcel containing the clubhouse facilities, management offices, and associated parking areas. Is that correct?" "Yes, officer. And this closing was completed before today's incident. 2 days ago." He nodded once before carefully returning the documents to the hood of my truck. Nobody spoke. The only sound came from the steady flutter of the American flag above the clubhouse roof. Patty's face had lost every trace of certainty. "No," she whispered, almost to herself. "Nobody told us." I answered honestly. The seller was responsible for notification under the existing agreements. My responsibility was completing the purchase and recording the deed. One of the board members hurried toward the clubhouse entrance and pulled on the front door as if the building itself might provide a different answer. Another searched through emails on his phone with growing urgency. The younger officer looked toward Patty again. "Ma'am, at this point, this appears to be a civil property matter involving recorded ownership. Based on the documentation we have verified, we do not have grounds to remove Mr. Caldwell from property his company legally owns." The sentence settled over the parking lot with complete silence. Every assumption that had filled the morning dissolved in a matter of seconds. The neighbors who had watched me as an outsider now looked back and forth between me, the clubhouse, and the officers, slowly realizing that the man they believed did not belong there had been standing on his own property the entire time. Patty looked from the officers to the clubhouse and then back at me as if repeating the same movement might somehow change the answer. It did not. Facts rarely cared about expectations. One of the board members finally broke the silence. "There has to be another document somewhere." I nodded slightly. "There probably is. Lease agreements, operating contracts, maintenance agreements, and vendor records. Those are all different from ownership." The distinction landed heavily across the group. They had spent years managing the property, but very few had apparently considered the legal foundation beneath those responsibilities. The older officer closed his notebook. "Our involvement here is complete unless someone reports a separate issue. Ownership questions are resolved through documentation, not assumptions." With that, the tension that had fueled the entire morning quietly dissolved. Nobody argued with the officers. Nobody demanded another explanation. The conversation had moved beyond opinions. Patty took one careful step toward me, her voice noticeably calmer than before. "If what you are saying is true, what happens now?" It was the first genuine question she had asked all morning. I reached into the portfolio again, this time removing a neatly organized folder instead of another deed. "Now we follow the existing agreements and the law." I handed her a single letter printed on company letterhead. She hesitated before accepting it. The paper trembled slightly in the breeze as she read the first paragraph. It was not an eviction notice. It was not a threat. It was a formal notice requesting a meeting to review the current occupancy agreement, building maintenance responsibilities, insurance requirements, and lease provisions that had transferred with the property sale. Every sentence had been prepared by my attorney before the closing. Every deadline reflected the contract already in effect. I had no interest in embarrassing anyone. My interest was making certain that every future decision rested on accurate legal ground instead of assumptions carried forward for years. Patty slowly lowered the letter. "You already planned all of this." I answered honestly. Long before I drove into the parking lot, one of the homeowners stepped closer, looking far more curious than upset. "Does this mean the clubhouse is closing?" "No," I replied. "People depend on this place. My goal has never been to interrupt the community. My goal is to understand how the property will be managed going forward." Several neighbors exchanged relieved looks. The concern that had replaced curiosity began to soften. They were not worried about who won an argument. They were worried about birthday parties, neighborhood meetings, holiday events, and the routines that made the community feel like home. I understood that. Buildings are valuable because people give them purpose. The younger officer smiled politely before returning the verified documents to me. Thank you for having everything organized, Mr. Caldwell. It made our job much easier. I slipped the paperwork back into the black leather portfolio and secured the brass clasp once again. The familiar click echoed softly across the quiet parking lot, the same sound that had begun this entire chain of events. Only now it meant something completely different. Earlier that morning, the portfolio had looked like an ordinary briefcase carried by a stranger. Now everyone standing there understood it had contained the truth from the very beginning. The only thing that had changed was that people were finally ready to read it. The patrol cars rolled away without urgency, leaving behind a neighborhood that suddenly felt much quieter than when I had arrived. The small crowd remained scattered across the parking lot, but the conversations had changed. Nobody was talking about removing a stranger anymore. They were talking about contracts, ownership, and how something so important could have happened without anyone realizing it. Patty stood near the clubhouse entrance holding the letter my attorney had prepared. She read it a second time, much more carefully than the first. The confidence that had carried her through the morning had been replaced by something far more useful. She was finally reading instead of assuming. One by one, the other board members stepped closer to look over her shoulder. Their expressions shifted from disbelief to concentration as they recognized familiar legal descriptions, parcel numbers, and references to agreements they had never personally reviewed. I waited patiently. There was nothing to celebrate. This was never about humiliating volunteers who had inherited responsibilities without questioning the paperwork behind them. It was about making sure everyone started from the same set of facts. A homeowner wearing a baseball cap approached me cautiously. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. If you own all of this now, are you going to raise fees or change everything?" I smiled because it was exactly the kind of question I would have asked if our positions had been reversed. No major decisions happen overnight. Communities work best when people understand what is changing before anything actually changes. He nodded slowly, clearly relieved. Within a few minutes, several more residents joined the conversation. Instead of challenging me, they asked practical questions about meeting schedules, maintenance plans, landscaping contracts, and whether the clubhouse would remain available for neighborhood events. I answered each one honestly. If I knew the answer, I shared it. If I did not, I said so. Trust begins with accurate expectations, not impressive promises. Patty finally walked over carrying the letter with both hands. Her tone was completely different now. "Mr. Caldwell, I owe you an apology. I believed I was protecting the community, but I acted before understanding the full situation. I appreciated that more than she probably realized. Admitting incomplete information is never easy, especially in front of an audience." "Thank you," I replied. This morning could have gone very differently if either of us had treated it like a personal fight. Fortunately, documents are much easier to work with than emotions. She gave a small, thoughtful smile. "I think our board has some records to review. I believe that would be a good place to start." The morning sun reflected across the clubhouse windows as neighbors slowly returned to their routines. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk again. Delivery trucks resumed their stops. The steady rhythm of ordinary life quietly returned to the neighborhood. Before leaving, I walked to the bronze plaque beside the entrance and brushed away a thin layer of dust with my hand. Earlier that morning, it had symbolized unquestioned authority. Now it simply marked the entrance to a building with a documented owner and a community ready to understand the difference between management and ownership. Sometimes the most important change is not who holds the keys. It is who finally takes the time to read the papers before deciding who belongs. 3 weeks later, I drove back through the same entrance just after sunrise. The air still carried the familiar scent of fresh-cut grass. The oak trees still cast long shadows across the parking lot, and the bronze plaque beside the clubhouse still reflected the morning light exactly as it had on the day everything changed. The neighborhood looked almost identical, yet it felt completely different. This time no one stepped in front of my truck. No phones appeared. No one questioned why I was there. Instead, Patty was already waiting outside the clubhouse holding a folder instead of a clipboard. As I parked, she walked over with a calm smile that carried none of the certainty she had worn weeks earlier. "Good morning, Ethan," she said. "The board has everything ready." We walked inside together. The meeting room smelled faintly of fresh paint and brewed coffee. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows onto the polished conference table where neatly organized binders rested in front of every chair. The board had spent days reviewing every agreement, every lease provision, every maintenance contract, and every insurance policy connected to the property. They had also hired independent legal counsel to explain the difference between managing a facility and owning the land beneath it. The conversations were no longer driven by assumptions or pride. They were driven by facts. During the meeting, we reached updated agreements that protected the community while recognizing the recorded ownership already established in the county records. The association would continue using the clubhouse under a revised lease. Residents would experience no interruption to scheduled events, and maintenance responsibilities would be clearly defined instead of casually assumed. By the time everyone signed the revised documents, the atmosphere around the table felt remarkably different from the confrontation outside only a few weeks earlier. Before leaving, Patty paused near the entrance. "I spent years believing confidence was enough," she admitted. "Now I know confidence without verification can create problems for everyone." I nodded. The good news is that good records solve problems much faster than arguments ever do. As I stepped outside, several residents waved from across the parking lot. A birthday party was being decorated inside the clubhouse. Children laughed near the walking trail. Landscapers trimmed hedges along the entrance while a delivery truck unloaded folding tables for a neighborhood fundraiser scheduled that weekend. The building had never really been about ownership alone. It had always been about the people who gathered inside it. Ownership simply determined who carried the responsibility to protect it properly. I unlocked the front entrance with the same key that had rested quietly in my pocket since the day I first arrived. The lock turned with a soft click, almost identical to the sound my black leather portfolio had made when I opened it in front of the officers. That simple sound reminded me how every important detail had been there from the very beginning. The portfolio, the recorded deed, the survey map, the businesslike silence. Every piece had been planted long before anyone realized what they meant. I looked once more at the clubhouse, now filled with ordinary life instead of extraordinary conflict, and realized the greatest victory had never been proving someone wrong. It had been replacing assumptions with truth without raising my voice. In business, as in life, authority can be claimed by anyone, but ownership must be proven, and justice rarely arrives with the loudest speech. It arrives with the right documents, the right signature, and the patience to let the facts speak for themselves.